Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafetz, and welcome to Law and Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film. Law is critical to many films. Films, in turn, tell us a lot about the law. In each episode, we'll examine a film that's noteworthy from a legal perspective. What legal issues does the film explore? What does it get right about the law, and what does it get wrong? And what does the film teach us about the law in the larger social and cultural context in which the law operates? Our two films for this episode are The Rack from 1956 and The Manchurian Candidate from 1962. The Rack, directed by Arnold Laven and written by Rod Serling, originally for television, tells the story of a decorated war hero, Captain Edward W. Hall Jr., played by Paul Newman, who returns to the U.S. after being captured and held as a POW in the Korean War. While a POW, it turns out, Hall was subjected to various forms of mental torture and ultimately collaborated with his captors, including by providing information and assisting in their propaganda efforts. Hall was then court-martialed, and he and his attorney, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Wasnick, played by Edmond O'Brien, seek to justify his conduct by demonstrating the pressure he was under and pain and suffering he endured. Hall is found guilty because ultimately he concedes he could have resisted more, as some soldiers who experienced physical torture did. Our second movie is the acclaimed Manchurian Candidate from 1962, directed and produced by John Frankenheimer from a screenplay by George Axelrod, which was based on the 1959 novel of the same name by Richard Condon. The film centers on the story of a highly decorated soldier, Sergeant Raymond Shaw, played by Laurence Harvey, who, along with the army platoon he commanded, was captured during the Korean War. During captivity, Shaw, along with other members of the platoon, including Major Bennett Marco, played by Frank Sinatra, were psychologically manipulated or brainwashed by their Chinese communist captors. Shaw was programmed to serve as a sleeper agent and to serve as a pawn in a communist fascist plot to take over the United States under a banner of McCarthyism and then impose martial law through a rising wave of anti-communist hysteria. The twist, and spoiler alert, is that his handler in the US is none other than his mother, Eleanor Shaw, played by Angela Lansbury, who received an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actress, who schemes ruthlessly to have her alcoholic and McCarthyite husband, Senator John Iselin, played by James Gregory, become vice president and then president, courtesy of a well-timed assassination by Raymond Shaw, who was acting under the brainwashing program. In the end, Major Marco exposes the plot to Raymond, who then shoots his mother and her husband, Senator Iselin, the vice presidential candidate, rather than the party's presidential nominee, before turning the gun on himself. Our guest today to talk about these two films and Hollywood during the Cold War era is Professor Lisa Hajjar. Professor Hajjar is the chair of the Sociology department at UC Santa Barbara. Professor Hajjar has an international reputation for work on sociology of law and conflict, human rights, political violence, and contemporary international affairs. She's an interdisciplinary scholar who contributes to multiple fields in the social sciences and humanities, including Middle East studies, American studies, and law and society. Her current research focuses primarily on the U.S. war on terror, particularly around the issues of torture, targeted killing, and Guantanamo. She's the only social scientist who's traveled to Guantanamo 14 times to date, where she conducts research and writes about the Guantanamo Military Commission. Another area of her current research focuses on human rights in the Arab world. Lisa's books include most recently The War in Court, Inside the Long Fight Against Torture, published by University of California Press from 2022. Her earlier books are Torture, A Sociology of Violence and Human Rights, published by Routledge Press in 2013, and Courting Conflict, The Israeli Military Court System in the West Bank and Gaza, published by UC Press in 2005. Lisa is also the author of numerous scholarly articles, including an article in Film and History entitled From the Manchurian Candidate to Zero Dark 30, Reading the CIA's History of Torture Through Hollywood Thrillers. And her journalistic writings have been published by The Nation, Al Jazeera, English, Middle East Report, and Jalaliya. It's my pleasure to introduce Lisa to talk about The Rack and the Manchurian Candidate and Hollywood in the Cold War era. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.
Lisa, both movies center on U.S. service members or soldiers captured during the Korean War and held prisoner, who then returned to the United States after the war. Can you talk a little bit more about the context of these two films?
Well, I had only seen the rack probably, maybe for the first time a decade ago, but because I have been working on torture since the 90s, it really attracted my attention. And so the context and what really fascinates me about each of the films and how they reflect each other is the significance of the Korean War and the experience of U.S. POWs who were captured and what they were subjected to in that war as it came to play a major role in the US history of torture, and specifically the way that the CIA took certain lessons from communist, particularly Chinese torture techniques, around mind control in order to develop their own, human experimentation and the MK-Ultra program. So these two films, they both kind of resonate with each other around the topic and the time frame, and they deal with the same issue. Like what happened to POWs in Chinese custody in the Korean War? And so, in some sense, that's the fascinating context. And people often refer to the Korean War as the forgotten war because, Vietnam comes on its heels and occupies a much greater place in American public imagination. But the Korean War, I think, particularly around these kind of questions, had some really incredible novel elements to them. And these two films really capture them.
So interesting. And I hadn't seen The Rack until we were kind of talking about this podcast. I'd never seen it before. It's not well known, but it's a really interesting film. Yeah, when you read it together with The Manchurian Candidate, you really do see this kind of emerging nucleus of films about the Korean War and the separate issues they raise. As you mentioned, it predates Vietnam, but also postdates World War II. And so it has its kind of own set of issues. And although closer in time, of course, to World War II, it's very different, I think, in terms of its take on soldiers and what happened to POWs.
I think coming out of World War II, this sense of victory and heroism, and the sense that, American soldiers just did the impossible. They defeated fascism, etc. And then getting into this military operation in Korea, especially what the RAC captures is what happened in Korea was unprecedented. And the US military was completely unprepared to deal for it. And essentially what happened was the kind of, as you mentioned, the psychological manipulation of POWs through certain kinds of techniques that did not, quote, look like torture. And so when POWs started coming back and the government realized how many of them who'd been captured had been seriously indoctrinated, it was this sense. So, the fact that soldiers could break under what did not look like, quote, torture. I mean, they weren't beaten, they weren't burnt with cigarettes, at least the ones that were indoctrinated were not beaten or burned with cigarettes or other conventional torture techniques. And so the rack perfectly captures the incomprehensibility of what happened and the incomprehensibility of how some POWs, a fair number of them, were able to be so quickly indoctrinated. And so that's why Paul Newman's character in the rack is an anti-hero. He's a guy who was broken, and then, the film kind of goes into what actually happened to him. Why was he broken?
I mean, the numbers are significant. I think, in your film and history piece, you cite the number, right? There were, I think it was estimated by the military that 1 out of every 10 of the 4,400 or so American POWs had, quote unquote, collaborated with the enemy, of whom about 13% were deemed guilty of serious collaboration, like writing disloyal tracts, agreeing to spy, organized for the communists after the war. So it's a big problem as the army sees it. They've got in their hand, and the film dramatizes it through the story of the Paul Newman character, Captain Edward Paul.
Because the military really collaborated with this filmmaking, it is, in some sense, I characterize it as a really didactic film. It's like putting forward the contemporary understanding of capture, patriotism, cowardice, etc., that really kind of drives home what the military was thinking at the time. But in terms of the real history, which I think the film does a good representation of, albeit, as you said, it's not a great film. It's but it's an important one, was that, when all these POWs start coming back and they realize something's happened to them, and even while they were in captivity, numerous POWs were writing letters home to their families, talking about how great the communists were, and there was all kinds of other sort of very disconcerting phenomena. And so the army did a study afterwards of all of 215 former POWs in order to understand what had happened to them. And so through that study of talking to people, and the Paul Newman character, epitomizes what they learned was that, they were subjected to exhaustion, isolation, humiliation, and then the constant demand for autobiographical information. And those weren't tactics that the US or anybody had any experience with prior to the Korean War. So it's both the tactics and their shockingly effective and rapid consequences on the psyches of POWs.
And Paul Newman, the Paul Newman character, is accused of essentially succumbing to these tactics. I mean, and he's a decorated military hero. So the film really sets it up in terms of the power of these tactics. He's someone who he's demonstrated his bravery. He's from a very proud military family. Actually appears he does resist for a period of time, but ultimately he succumbs and he's court-martialed for collaborating with the enemy. Let's play a clip now from the film. And this is a discussion of this new form of mental torture, or what Paul Newman's defense counsel, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Wasnick, played by Edmond O'Brien, calls a new form of duress. So I'll play the clip now.
This, gentlemen, is the new duress. It isn't brainwashing, it never was. No drugs were used. No attempt was made to eradicate the mind. But every device was used to make it suffer. In Captain Hall, we have a strong man whose combat record shows him capable of withstanding immense physical pain without giving an inch. Yet the same man had no chance when forced to undergo a program of confession and mental agony. This program worked in stages. First, you create an atmosphere of terror and uncertainty. Then you take away the leaders, tear down health and morale, infiltrate the ranks with informers, and when you can't get informers, spread the word that you've got them anyhow. Turn an army into a nightmare school, and the soldiers into small boys who depend on you for childish rewards and punishments. Make them all lonely and distrustful. Then pick out the loneliest and go to work on him. Make him think that you alone hold the power to forgive. Then find the personal hidden key, and once you've found it, turn it hard. Every one of us has that key. The defense rests.
Can you elaborate a little more about how this film treats this new form of duress, this mental rack, in terms of the larger context we've been talking about?
Well, so as a courtroom film, I mean, like much of the film itself takes place in the courtroom. And so O'Brien is the defense lawyer and Wendell Corey plays the prosecutor. And so what's really being played out are these two kinds of visions of what a soldier in captivity should do. And so what the defense is arguing in the courtroom, and that clip kind of illustrates it, is they're trying to, make the argument that what Hall did, or how he responded to his treatment, is a normal human behavior. The defense doesn't challenge the allegations. He did sign like a propaganda tract. He did do all the things that he's accused of. But what the defense is trying to argue is, why did he do that? And so in order to make the why argument, they're really narrating this kind of what he said, like the new form of duress, which is really tactics that were not well known or common or anything that US soldiers captured in previous wars had been subjected to. And then that's contradicted then by the understanding that none of that, as the prosecutor says, constitutes a legally valid form of torture, and therefore he should have toughened up and been able to endure. So, one of the real tensions in the courtroom scene is, what can a human being endure, or what kind of conditions cause someone to break? And that's like sort of the larger story about why this film is so significant.
And in terms of the definition of torture, it's interesting. It's an assumption built in that torture comes in the form of the physical rack. And the Paul Newman character is contrasted with Captain John Miller, played by Lee Marvin, the Lee Marvin character, who's subjected to physical torture, right? He's subjected to quote unquote real torture. He's stripped naked, hung from his ankle like a hog, and burned with cigarettes. So the film accepts sort of that's torture, but you're right, it doesn't accept what happened to Paul Newman as psychological torture. And then the legal issue is, as the film breaks it out in terms of the military or the court-martial prosecution, is whether Paul Newman could have resisted longer, whether he willingly gave aid and support to the enemy. And the assumption is that if he, quote unquote, broke, right, to use the language of the film, under physical torture, right, if he'd been actually put on a physical rack and stretched, or something sharp under his fingernails, or whatever various form of physical torture you want to think about, his will would have been broken. He would be cleared.
And it would be legible. It would be legible to the military's understanding at the time, So the military was just like, we see the burns, that Lee Marvin experienced. That's torture. And he didn't break. And all you, Paul Newman, were subjected to was being held in a dank underground cell and forced to keep your back straight for months at a time and, sleep in a muddy puddle. That's not torture.
Exactly. And here's a clip of the cross-examination you mentioned by the prosecutor, Major Sam Moulton's the character's name, played by Wendell Corey. He's kind of a reluctant prosecutor. He's not a gung-ho prosecutor. He sort of feels he has to do his duty to uphold the law, but he does it quite effectively. So here's Wendell Corey character cross-examining the Paul Newman character.
Captain Hall, during the period of isolation you described yesterday, were you struck or beaten? I mean, were you subjected to physical torture of any kind?
No.
You were questioned at length under adverse physical conditions.
Yes.
Result of which, among other things, you informed on Captain Miller.
I didn't know he'd escaped.
It doesn't matter whether you knew that. Did you knowingly sign a document informing on him? A document which, sooner or later, could be used by the communists to break the will of other men who were planning to escape?
I signed.
Captain, how many officers were there in the camp?
About 60.
Did any of them sign documents or make speeches or make threats to other men?
Not to my knowledge.
Isn't it the fact that the overwhelming majority of officers, when asked to collaborate, volunteered only their name, their rank, and their serial numbers they've been trained to, as Captain Miller did, even under torture?
I guess so.
And is it not also a fact that those who did not hold intercourse with their captors, other than what was permitted by Army regulations, who gave the Chinese no opening, no opportunity to pry, that they fared much better than you did?
Yes.
In other words, Captain Hall, you received the treatment you received only because at the outset you showed a willingness to collaborate. Now, isn't that correct?
Maybe.
Granting, of course, that your motives in the beginning were the most exalted. Yes or no?
Yes.
Despite these exalted reasons, you were one of the few officers who saw fit to betray his country.
Objection. Sustained.
Very well. Now, Captain, let's examine for a moment this so-called breaking point of yours. Your horizon of endurable anguish, as the defense counsel so poetically described it. Now, do you believe you reached your breaking point?
Yes.
What do you suppose made you break, Captain Hall? We know it wasn't starvation, don't we?
Yes.
And you didn't think you were going to freeze to death?
No.
It wasn't the pain in your leg that made you break?
No.
Or the threat of death?
They said I was a war criminal. I thought once they might kill me.
Did they ever threaten to execute?
They never spelled it up. No.
No. And we certainly know it wasn't just because you weren't comfortable. That didn't make you break.
What, not being comfortable?
Nobody was very comfortable, we know that. No, it wasn't any of those things. The thing that made you collapse was loneliness. Isn't that what you said?
Yes.
This matter of loneliness interests me. I'd like to examine it for a moment.
May I have some water, please?
Certainly. Now, Captain Hall, can you tell me about some special time where this loneliness was very bad? Some time before you were in Korea?
You mean a special day or what?
Yes, a day would be fine.
Well, I don't know. Some days were worse than others, I guess.
You mean there was no day when the loneliness was so bad that you just couldn't stand it?
You make it sound like a toothache.
Well, you must have had one tooth that ached worse than the others.
What do you mean?
One day! What was the loneliest day you remember?
The day my mother died.
The day your mother died. We heard from your autobiography that the Chinese made you write, where they found you were a very lonely boy, and they beat you with it. Is that right?
Yes, I admitted I was lonely.
You admitted it? To yourself?
Yes, for the first time.
For the first time? You mean never before in your life had you ever said to yourself, Ed, let's face it, I'm lonely?
Yes, I may have.
And if you were aware of it, it wasn't any news to you. So why did you decide to pick that special night to collapse?
I didn't pick it. It was the night that I found out about my brother.
His name was Pete.
Pete, yes.
That made you even more lonely.
Yes, it made just like there was nothing all of a sudden.
Sort of a hopeless feeling.
Hopeless, yes, like when my mother died.
When your mother died, you felt the same way, so you just couldn't stand it, didn't you? But you found you could stand it, and you went on.
I had to.
Couldn't you have gone on after you heard about Pete?
Maybe I could have.
Maybe you could have. Then why didn't you? Captain Hall, did you ever reach your horizon of endurable anguish? Or were you only afraid that you might? Couldn't you have gone on a little longer? Maybe a day, an hour, even a minute? Think clearly, Captain. Did you ever break? Did you ever really break? No, I didn't. No further questions.
So, because the Paul Newman character admits that he could have resisted longer, that he didn't even take it all the way to the end, that he could have fought longer before collaborating, he's ultimately found guilty. And as we mentioned, he's contrasted with the Lee Marvin character, who is subjected to physical torture and who the Paul Newman character informs on, although he doesn't really know he's informing on him. He says that the Lee Marvin character was planning to escape, although he didn't know that the Lee Marvin character was actually trying to do so. But in any event, he kind of indirectly rats him out. But, Lee Marvin character is subjected to this brutal physical torture, and he doesn't break. Yeah, just talking a little bit more about the message the film is sending about breaking or non-breaking and what makes people break and why that matters so much to the military point of view coming out of the Korean War.
Well, let me just slightly re-angle that question, because in the larger picture, what was so surprising was that very few POWs were subjected to those kind of brutal physical techniques. Like the vast majority were subjected to, not that they were non-physical, but that they weren't coming out of the kind of imaginary of like the brutality of torture. And so the ones who were tortured the way the Lee Marvin character is were characterized by their communist captors as reactionaries. In other words, if they refused to submit to the indoctrination, whereas the other ones like Hall were more compliant. And so even in the Army study that was done, like sort of navigating this new phenomenon that very few people were brutally tortured, but many were broken. The film itself, Wendell Corey in his courtroom presentation is almost literally quoting from the Army study, which really sort of elevates and says torture is like the bastinado or the Iron Maiden or the rack or the water dripping continuously on the head or the splinters under the fingernails. Like that's torture. And, uncomfortable treatment, soldiers should be capable of withstanding that. Battle is a, already uncomfortable thing. But, it bears mentioning, like probably the thing that really affected Hall the most was the protracted isolation. And of course, that becomes a big part of the plot, like what happened to him and being alone and lonely. But the film, in its didactic way, mocks his response to being held in protracted isolation. So it's like, you were lonely. You were a lonely guy. You were lonely. And so they're like flattening out this experience, which we now know that, protracted isolation does constitute torture, but at the time it didn't. And they couldn't even comprehend it as anything but like a human weakness to not be able to handle a little bit of loneliness in a communist prison camp. Really, it's a brilliant snapshot of the era.
Yeah, it does. In terms of how these techniques were viewed and it's belittled in a way, loneliness, that wasn't so hard. And then they tie it into this kind of family psychodrama with Paul Newman. He wants the approval of his father. And what makes him break in the end is the news of his brother's death. So it's kind of reduced to this family drama when the actual isolation is something that causes great hardship.
Well, one of the most dramatic scenes, it's really the kind of turning point in the film, is when the father, who's played by Walter Pidgeon, he's like delighted that his son has survived. The other son died in the war. That's sad, but he's like just so happy. And he's like his war hero son who survived a communist prison camp. And then the night the son, Paul Newman actually comes out of the hospital and returns home and there's a party. And at the end of the party, another general comes and thinks that, Walter Pidgeon, the father, spit and polished soldier himself, has already learned that his son is up for court-martial, and he doesn't know this. And when he's told by this other general, like, your son collaborated with the enemy, he goes running up the stairs, and it's like, why didn't you die? Why didn't you die? It's so shameful, it's so incomprehensible that somebody would break and do what they're being accused of. And then sort of you get through the courtroom drama, the different ways in which people understand the different interpretations of that kind of experience.
Yeah, it's so interesting the way the film sets that up. It's contrasted with the Lee Marvin character and the idea, right, what's a soldier supposed to do when they're captured? And it's kind of become a cliche, name, rank, and serial number. You mentioned in your article that actually was encapsulated by an executive order.
as a result of these experiences in Korea and the fact that such a high proportion of US POWs were broken, et cetera, and collaborated with the enemy, Eisenhower issues an executive order basically sort of affirming and insisting that the only thing US prisoners of war are allowed to do, should do, and the only thing that's acceptable is the name, rank, and serial number, and that they must withhold all other information. Like there's really no room for human weakness. It's like, this is the policy, and the policy is based on national security needs, et cetera. So there's no sense that any other alternative would approach. But so what's then becomes interesting is like, could I just put this in context? And like several things happen. So the official line of the government, as the RAC captures and Eisenhower's executive order captures, so the military and the CIA in real life take two different courses. The military establishes a program called the Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape Program, or SERE program. And that program basically trains soldiers. It started in the Air Force with pilots that might be at risk of being shot down by countries and taken captive by countries that didn't respect the Geneva Conventions, and the kind of techniques that were used, that they were learning from the POWs. They institute this into the SERE training program so that soldiers are actually put through a torture regimen on the assumption that if they've experienced those things, they'll be better prepared if it ever happens to them in real life. So the SERE program, it was originally established for the Air Force, and then by Vietnam, it sort of was expanded to all other divisions of the military. But it really was about training US soldiers to withstand communist torture. And it uses the communist torture techniques as a way to train them, like waterboarding, isolation, nakedness, et cetera, all the kinds of things that they learned communist interrogators were using in Korea. But the CIA takes a different lesson, which is, let's see what those techniques that the Chinese were doing to such great effect on our POWs, and let's, start working on that. And so that really launches the whole CIA's mind control experimentation in the mid-1950s, which many people have written about, but it's most famously, referred to as the MK-Ultra program. Like that was the evolving experimentation and use of torture by the CIA in a very clandestine way that builds on this, sort of experience of Korea in order to basically beat the commies at their own game.
And the CIA develops it, and then it uses it in the counterinsurgency in Vietnam, working with the right-wing governments and death squads in Latin America during the dirty wars of the late 70s and the 80s. It's really interesting the way you lay that out, because you've got a couple things going on, it sounds like. One, you've got the military, sort of the official line, which is adopted in good part, I think, by the film. I think the film does give some credit to the fact that it was a form of suffering, and even the Lee Marvin character warms up a bit back up to Paul Newman, even though Paul Newman ratted him out, or thinks he ratted him out about his escape. The movie props up kind of the army line about a stiff upper lip and psychological torture. Real soldiers don't break under psychological torture if they break at all. Right. Then you've got the military saying, well, wait a minute, something's going on here. We got to study this and train our soldiers so they can resist. And then you've got the CIA, and I guess the part of the military intelligence, saying, wait a minute, we're fighting the last war. We've got to learn how to exploit these techniques, not just to protect our soldiers, but to use against insurgents and other conflicts.
Right. I mean, like from the 50s on, as they would say, like the mind was a Cold War battlefield. But I would just actually draw one other point, like the end of the RAC, when after Newman has been convicted of most of the crimes that he's been charged with, but then he takes the stand and kind of concedes. He's like, I had a chance to be great and hold out, but I lost my opportunity to be magnificent. I mean, it's really like the cherry on the sundae of this lesson that the military wants to convey, is that you really must be able to hold out no matter what.
I mean, Edmond O'Brien, I think, is terrific in the role as the defense. He does a really good job, maybe better than the film wanted him to do, the director wanted him to do, of portraying the suffering and the real conflict that Paul Newman has. But at the end of the day, it resolves with Paul Newman being found guilty of most of the charges, and then, as you say, kind of going up and trying to, encourage soldiers to resist, and that he could have done better.
Well, even just for the film buffs who really enjoy watching films, as some of your earlier episodes have captured, it was like military court-martials. I mean, this is a very, at least in my very limited experience, very accurate way of like the kind of politesse between the prosecution and the defense, because they're all, respectable officers, but they're playing with these life and death kind of issues. It does a really good job just kind of representing the tropes and the scenarios one would find in a serious court-martial.
Absolutely. I mean, it seems like if the rack has a large foot or a large part in the 50s, the Manchurian Candidate shifts fully, and it's really a movie of the 1960s, and it reflects very different era, and it's got a very different message. So psychological manipulation is central to the Manchurian Candidate. And I'll play a clip now from that movie. It's one of the many famous scenes where Major Bennett Marco, played by Frank Sinatra, begins to recall in a nightmare how he and Sergeant Raymond Shaw, played by Laurence Harvey, and other members of the army platoon were quote unquote brainwashed or conditioned, to use the phrase of their Chinese interrogators. And in the scene, the men are programmed to think they're awaiting out a storm in the lobby of a small hotel in New Jersey where a ladies' garden club is meeting. There's a lot of talk about hydrangeas. And the architects of the conditioning program demonstrate this new tool of warfare to the other Chinese and I think Soviet scientists in the audience, including by showing how powerful they are by getting Shaw to murder in cold blood 2 members of the platoon. So here's this famous clip from the Manchurian Candidate.
Allow me to introduce our American visitors. I must ask you to forgive their somewhat lackadaisical manners, but I have conditioned them, or brainwashed them, which I understand is the new American word, to believe that they are waiting out a storm in the lobby of a small hotel in New Jersey, where a meeting of the Ladies' Garden Club is in progress.
You will notice that I have told them they may smoke. I've allowed my people to have a little fun in the selection of bizarre tobacco substitutes. Are you enjoying your cigarette, Ed?
Yes, ma'am. Yak dung. Oh, tastes good, like a cigarette should. Now then, comrade.
May I present the famous Raymond Shaw?
Young man, you've flown 8,000 miles to this dreary spot in Manchuria to see. Raymond, pull your chair over here by me, please. I am sure you've all heard the old wives' tale that no hypnotized subject may be forced to do that which is repellent to his moral nature, whatever that may be. Nonsense, of course. Oh, you note-takers might set down a reminder to consult Brenman's paper, Experiments in the Hypnotic Production of Antisocial and Self-Injurious Behavior, or Wells' 1941 paper, which was titled, I believe, Experiments in the Hypnotic Production of Crime.
Or, of course, Andrew Salter's remarkable book, Conditioned Reflex Therapy, to name only 3. Or if it offends you that only the West is working to manufacture more crime and better criminals.
Against the modern shortages, I suggest Krasnogorsky's Primary Violence Motivation, or Serav's The Unilateral Suggestion to Self-Destruction.
My dear Jan, as you grow older, you grow more long-winded. And to get to the point, has the man ever killed anyone? Or has he not?
I apologize, my dear Dmitri. I keep forgetting that you're a young country and your attention span is limited. Tell me, Raymond, have you ever killed anyone?
No, ma'am.
Not even in combat?
In combat? Yes, ma'am, I think so.
Of course you have, Raymond. Raymond has been a crack shot since childhood.
Marvelous outlet for his aggressions. May I have the bayonet, please?
Not with the knife, with the hands.
With the hands?
Here, have him use this.
Ah, da. Raymond, whom do you dislike the least in your group here today?
The least?
That's right.
Well, I guess Captain Marco, ma'am.
Notice how he is always drawn to authority. That won't do, Raymond. We need the captain to get you your medal. Who else?
Well, I guess Edmond O'Brien, ma'am.
Ah, that's better. Now then, Raymond, take this scarf and strangle Edmond O'Brien. to death.
So, Lisa, can you talk a little bit more about the term brainwashing, its origins, and the role it plays in the film?
So the concept of brainwashing as a result of the Korean War and that experience, and the experience of POWs and like, oh my God, the communists have these miraculous methods. And so there was this incredible, anxiety about, the ability of people to be, if they're taken, to just turn into like calculated operatives of the communists. Of course, there's an earlier history of that with like, Invasion of the Body Snatchers and others. But just for 1 second, going back to the rack, like when, the Edmond O'Brien character is making the case about what happened to Paul Newman, he's like, it's not brainwashing, it never was. Whereas in the Manchurian Candidate, the Chinese scientist is like, we have washed their brains. In fact, they're, so washed, they've been dry cleaned. So they're really latching on to that kind of paranoia. But I think the concept of brainwashing, or the term brainwashing, was coined by like an American journalist who had done a lot of work sort of looking at how the Chinese regime was able to produce a kind of mass compliance by society, like in the Cultural Revolution and in earlier periods, and saying like brainwashing is not really a thing, but the concept really captures the imagination, and that capturing that imagination, that is the crux of the Manchurian Candidate, that it's possible under certain conditions. And the conditions in the 1962 version of the Manchurian Candidate, the conditions that created these guys, like where their memories were erased by their scientific interrogator handlers and replaced with new memories. You don't actually know what happens. All you see is in that like fascinating scene that shifts back and forth between a real scientific civilian and the old ladies talking about hydrangeas, is just, as you said, the efficacy of these effects. It's just really incredible.
It's amazing seeing the way the Manchurian Candidate slips, as you said, back and forth between, temporally and between kind of different views of reality. It just makes it such a great film and so powerful and evocative. One of the lines I love from your article, you said that the rack operates on the level of earnest debate over patriotism, its meaning and its limits. The Manchurian Candidates operates on the level of satire of America's Cold War fears of communist world domination. Tell us a little bit more about that. I think that really hits the nail on the head.
In the film, the Manchurian Candidate, I mean, it has so much resonance for today. As you said, the Angela Lansbury character, she's ostensibly this hyper-patriotic McCarthyite woman, and her idiot, second husband is, like really framed like McCarthy himself. And it's, the way in which she articulates her anti-communist bona fides is to call everybody who disagrees with her a socialist, and then to be like hyperventilating about the dangers of communism, and we must be tough and fight. So that's like the great ruse in the story, where she's actually running, or at least a participant in this operation, to have a programmed killer come onto the scene. And so, I just think that the notions, the Red Scare, the ability during the 1950s, the actual McCarthy trials, and the lives shattered and the careers ruined, as a result of this like extreme paranoia and literal, like witch hunting or commie hunting throughout the government, along with like at the same time back in the 50s, it was like homosexual hunting, sort of like the weak links in American society. Those kind of things could justify all kinds of, abuses or restrictions in the name of national security, because of the idea that there's a legitimate danger out there, the danger of indoctrination, the danger of susceptibility to socialism. And then when you start pointing out like a bunch of socialists who are in government, it just kind of affirms the gullibility of the American public to kind of be persuaded by this narrative. And we see that today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so great how the hard McCarthyite, like Iselin, the second husband, Angela Lansbury, and Angela Lansbury herself, right? But they're really, they're riding this wave of anti-communist hysteria. But their plan is, once they do that and they get the presidential nominee assassinated and Iselin comes in and takes over as president. Angela Lansbury doesn't want her son to, she's very upset that it's her son who was picked to do it as opposed to someone else. But once that happens, then they're going to impose a kind of a communist fascist regime and emergency power that makes martial law look like a cakewalk. She says something to that effect, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a great satire.
And what really makes the movie timeless, I think, is like that, it illustrates, again, coming up to the present, that hyper-patriotism is the perfect foil for treason. Angela Lansbury, the most hyper-patriotic, socialist, finding person is in fact the biggest traitor of them all.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And the plot is outlandish, in literal sense, but there's some real things that resonate. So, like, for example, there's this an interchange between the left-leaning Senator Thomas Jordan, played by John MacGyver, who's accused of being a communist. He's the object of the ire of Eleanor Iselin, the Angela Lansbury character. But his daughter, Jocelyn, right? Jordan's daughter, Jocelyn, played by Leslie Parrish, Shaw's in love with her. And so Eleanor asked Jordan if he would block her husband, Johnny's vice presidential nomination. And he responds, quote, "There are people who think of Johnny as a clown and a buffoon, but I do not. I despise Johnny Iselin and everything that Iselinism, aka McCarthyism, right, has come to stand
Trumpism.
for. Or aka Trumpism, right. I think if Johnny Iselin were a paid Soviet agent, we'll leave a pregnant pause there, he could not do more to harm this country than he's doing now." So sounds familiar, right?
Right. One of the things that's, I think, brilliant about the film is that, Angela Lansbury's character is made to be unlikable, although you shift your unlike from her hyper-patriotism to her, communist traitorism to, use assassination. But it also is like the character of Laurence Harvey really is also an anti-hero. And if you even tease it back a little bit, how does the Laurence Harvey character, who's been literally brainwashed, compared to the, character of Paul Newman, who's was broken as a result of certain kind of effects. And one of the, kind of one of the brilliant elements in the Manchurian Candidate is that, all of his, people in his unit were brainwashed because he's really a despicable asshole, but they've all been brainwashed to think that whenever they're asked about him, he is the kindest, gentlest, most generous, brave person I've ever met, and so that's also, whereas in fact, he's actually kind of a jerk, and then he becomes like a robot. But the one time when his human emotions come out, and it's all like his pliability, his unlikable character is literally in relationship to his overweening mother. He says he's hated his mother. I mean, it's really Napoleon. But, then he just talks about how he could be a lovable guy.
It's really interesting. I mean, well, one thing about his mother, Angela Lansbury is very domineering, horrible person. I mean, the book, I think she's worse. There's that famous scene in the movie where Angela Lansbury kisses him on the mouth. But in the book, they have an affair, actually. So I think, which they left out of the movie, but she's horrible. And they have that moment where Laurence Harvey character could have been someone else, right? Where they go back in time and they show him falling in love with Jocelyn Jordan, the daughter of Senator Tom Jordan, right? And they go back and he was becoming someone else. And then, his mother puts him back onto the path. And then basically he's programmed to kill her, his love, and Senator Jordan. Right.
Actually, I didn't know, because I hadn't read the book. Well, I should have, but I didn't know about the incest element. I mean, there's sort of a creepy thing in the movie, but when you put it in that context, it's that further kind of explains in a filmic way how both the susceptibility and the and the hatred that he develops for his mother, having been subjected to an incestuous relationship, talk about brainwashing or mind manipulation, that's the original sin, in that sense.
Exactly. I mean, I think she's only 3 or so years older than Laurence Harvey in the movie. I mean, but it's creepy enough in the movie, even without that detail. And then ultimately he turns the gun on Angela Lansbury, right? And Iselin, because he knows that's the only way to stop him. But what you said before too about the way that Raymond Shaw was so disliked, that's actually, I think, one of the things that tips Frank Sinatra character off is everyone's just praising him they sound like robots, Raymond Shaw is the greatest, bravest person ever. And it's just what? This guy's such a jerk.
Kind of the way in which the story really begins, and that you mentioned it before, it unfolds, is that they were brainwashed in China, according to this. And then once they've been back for a year or 2 years, they start having nightmares, and they're starting to realize what they think they know and what they are saying and ostensibly know are two different things. And as some of them go mad, as a result of their dreams, that's what really drives Frank Sinatra to start figuring out. And he himself also has these disconcerting dreams that are completely different than what he thinks he knows. And one of the, just to say, as an aside, one brilliant thing about the film, when I rewatched it for the X number of times recently, just for this podcast, was that one of the men in the units who's black soldier, when they're depicting his dreams, all the women in the garden club are black. So I just think it's also just a really fascinating way of representing how people's own thoughts or preferences kind of get folded into these layers of deception and reality.
Yeah, that's a super interesting detail. And there's so much in this film. That's really
Yeah.
interesting. Well, The Manchurian Candidate was remade in 2004. A lot of great people worked on it. Jonathan Demme directed it. The cast featured Denzel Washington, Lev Schreiber, Meryl Streep. It's not anywhere near as good as the original. I'm not going out on a limb here, I don't think. But it's interesting nonetheless. So in some respects, the remake adheres to the main plot structure of the original. You've got a group of soldiers led by a decorated and well-connected U.S. officer, i.e. the Raymond Shaw character, who are captured by the enemy. Here, the war is the first Gulf War. They're psychologically manipulated, but here through a much more direct, literal way. They have a chip implanted in their brain. And then they return to America to serve as pawns in a plot to overtake the U.S. government. But the remake made some important changes in updating the story. Well, one, you have the war change, right? Korean War, where they are brainwashed by the Chinese in the actual Manchuria. In the remake, the Korean War is replaced by the Gulf War, and Manchurian is now the name of the nefarious multinational private equity company plotting with Raymond Shaw's mother, played by Meryl Streep, who now is a senator and not the wife of a senator, to take over the country. Can we talk about some of the changes they made and what are some of the new fears or social realities that the remake is trafficking in?
What really struck me about the contrast between the original and the remake, just in terms of what happens to these guys when they're at POWs. Like in the original Manchurian Candidate, you don't really see what happens, but it's like clearly set up by John Frankenheimer, the director, to, satirize these things. Like the pavilion where they're in when they're being, shown to the Russian and Chinese scientists has like giant posters of Stalin and Mao, and there's a lot of like exchanges among the different communist observers, about how their countries differ. Whereas in the remake, they're captured and tortured in the context of an Arab world. And so it's like overtly Orientalist. Like it brings like worst world Orientalist tropes with science fiction where they're like drilling into their heads. I mean, so there's nothing subtle about the manipulation. I'm sure that the negative depictions of Orientalist nefarious Arabs would play well in the time frame, 2004. So it loses some of the subtlety. And just to say that, to the credit of the filmmakers of the remake, they're trying to capture a present danger. But unlike communism, which was very obvious and there's a whole war against it, like this danger, there is like nefarious capitalism. So it doesn't quite have the same punch, as the original.
Global. Right?
Exactly, Manchurian Global. And you don't really even know what Manchurian Global wants to do. It's like you don't really, how are they going to take over the world that doesn't already exist in our world?
It's great they remade it so we can talk a little about it on the podcast. But other than that, I don't know.
It's a must skip. It's a must skip.
Yeah. But I guess to some extent, it's the way that like the word Manchurian has entered the lexicon. I think it's been going on for years. I mean, most recently, you've got kind of trade-offs on Manchurian. Trump referred to as the Manchurian Candidate due to Russian influence, and Trump referring to Biden as the Manchurian Candidate. I gotta wonder if Trump ever saw the movie, but due to foreign influence over him. So, it endures too as a movie of not just about the Cold War era, but about conspiracy and conspiracy theories.
Yes, exactly. Sort of like plots and evil characters, in our midst.
The Manchurian Candidate itself became kind of part of the original Manchurian Candidate, part of the conspiracy story or conspiracy theories around the Kennedy assassination, because the film, which came out in 1962, in 1964, Frank Sinatra, who's lead in the film, purchased it, or the rights to it, and he kept it out of release from 1964 to 1988. So it was kind of pulled from the shelves, to use the language of the day, I guess. And there were theories, like conspiracy theories, were that, it might have been connected via Sinatra to a cover-up of the Kennedy assassination. Now, I think it's very clear it was really about a dispute over a contract and money. So that was what it was. But even the film itself kind of got tied up in these larger conspiracy theories.
I mean, I just remember like when I saw it for the first, I probably saw it when it comes back out sometime in the late 80s and was thinking like, where was this film all my life? I mean, since it's came out, I've like watched it 20 times because of course I love film. I will watch them over and over again. But really that long missing period, sort of strikes you once you see it now.
Lisa, let's move to some more roughly current events. So in some respect, both films, I guess really more particularly The Rack and issues around psychological torture resurface after 9/11, when the CIA develops the torture program or the detention, rendition, interrogation program. And this appears in various films, including Zero Dark 30, which you talk about in your article. So can you talk about this kind of resurfacing and psychological torture in The Rack?
Well, so, I mean, if we really think about what happened to the CIA, so the CIA in the Cold War era early on, because of Korea, latches on and develops a program that draws heavily from the torture techniques that were used by the communists, and then institutes, and the military sets up its own, the SERE program, to train people to withstand that. But because the CIA had such like an ignominious history, coups and overthrowing of regimes and death squads and all the kind of things that they were doing throughout the Cold War. Then we come to, for example, revelations in the 1970s, through the exposure of COINTELPRO. And I mean, the CIA always acts illegally, but the kind of beyond acceptable levels of illegality, that really come to bear. So in the 1990s, the Cold War has ended. And so the CIA really shifts away and kind of leaves behind all the kind of human intelligence programs that they had been developing, using, applying, and training others to use, and et cetera, during the Cold War. And they really shift to signals intelligence, like sort of eavesdropping, spying, and so on. And so after 9/11, the nation suddenly realizes we have a dearth of human intelligence. And like an organization like Al-Qaeda, you can't like aerially surveil them or find out in the way one could with a conventional enemy. And so the CIA essentially dusts off its manuals from the Cold War, the Kubark manual, or the one that was developed later, the Human Exploitation Manual that becomes public in 1997 was from 1983. And so essentially what the CIA does, and if we can talk in more detail about the CIA torture program, was they hired two people, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessup, whose only claim to fame was that they were psychologists, and they were trainers, military trainers for soldiers in the SERE program. And so the CIA hires them as contractors. And so they put together a menu of interrogation tactics based on SERE, based on the communist model. And they call this the re-engineering of SERE. And those techniques were what the Bush administration authorized, the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel characterized as legal because they didn't rise to the level of torture, which is almost a throwback to what the RAC is saying, that torture is the bastinado and, the Iron Maiden, and what we're doing is not torture. And so we can see that the torture authorized for the CIA, which they engaged in, which then spreads to the military in the first years of the war on terror, there's a direct line from Korea. And so if you think, or if you read any of the numerous autobiographies of former prisoners from Guantanamo, or anybody can read the statement by Majid Khan, who was one of the CIA prisoners who was held for years and then transferred to Guantanamo in 2006. He finally pleaded guilty. And in 2021, I believe, at his sentencing hearing, it was the first time somebody who had been in CIA custody was able to really talk about what had been done to him by CIA interrogators and contractors. And what he describes, the kind of efforts to demoralize him and break him and the tactics that were used, are very reminiscent of what the Hall character went through in the RAC. And so you're seeing the CIA has no qualms about utilizing the very tactics that had disgraced them 2 decades earlier, and that technically the government prior to 9/11 would have regarded as utterly unacceptable and illegal behavior. It becomes US policy. And so we're still living in the shadow of the techniques that were created in Korea and adopted by the US government.
You have in the middle of Korea and 9/11, Watergate and the exposure of the CIA and the Church Commission and all the various reforms, exposing of the various things the CIA as well as the FBI do in the programs they ran. And then you have the resumption after 9/11.
I mean, former Vice President Dick Cheney, when Cheney came to office, and he really took control of the national security portfolio after 9/11 because Bush had no foreign policy or other experience. I mean, Cheney had been Secretary of Defense at one point. And one of his long-running political agendas was to reverse the reforms that had been instituted in the 1970s, including, the kind of guardrails put onto executive power as a result of the Church Commission and other things. And so you can see a direct hand that Cheney has in, saying the hell with those kind of restrictions. The president should be allowed to do whatever he wants, and let's, authorize the full gamut of things and just say national security justifies everything.
It's kind of an amazing journey that these techniques take. And go back to the rack for a second, it's almost like coming full circle in an odd way, because the psychological torture, right, which the prosecution and the court-martial and the rack say it's not real torture, real soldiers resist, right? Those techniques later become adopted by the U.S. and the U.S. government after 9/11, and they, realize these are the most effective ways. They think they're the most effective ways to get intelligence. I think the Feinstein report shows they didn't really get much of any valuable intelligence from them, but that becomes the way the U.S. tries to get information. So kind of in a way, it's almost like a rebuttal to the prosecution's argument in the rack, being like, you think those don't really work? Then why is the U.S. government using those techniques? And the language was exactly this, that they would try to render people sense of helplessness. That's what the U.S. government sought to do through its non-physical torture, or some of it was physical. I mean, certainly waterboarding is physical, but torture that's not meant to leave scars. The isolation, the sensory deprivation, to create the sense of helplessness, which exactly was happening in the rack.
One way we can think about this, and you know this as well as anybody, that when the Justice Department was asked by the CIA and decided to legalize these tactics, the infamous August 1, 2002 memo, which basically redefines torture and then authorizes all the re-engineered SERE techniques, which was written by then Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the Office of Legal Counsel, John Yoo, who now holds a distinguished chair at Berkeley Law School, to its everlasting shame. The argument was, those things don't rise to the level of torture. In other words, they're not real torture. They're not burning with cigarettes. They're not this. So rejecting the significance of mental torture, or even, as you said, the non-scarring techniques, that they aren't torture. If they're not torture, they're not illegal. If they're not illegal, therefore we can use them. Here's a license to torture.
Thanks for pointing that out. It's quite a pivot. It's like they're effective, but we're going to have to define them as non-torture because, well, it's illegal and it would harm the reputation. And a lot of this is about a war of ideas. So yeah, they incorporate it, but they still don't treat it as torture because they can't afford to, because it would be criminal.
And one of the things I would say, again, to bring it up to like literally today, the inefficacy of the CIA's torture techniques is evident by the fact that the authorization of torture by the CIA made it impossible to prosecute the people who were accused of major crimes. I mean, the 5 suspects in the 9/11 case, there's another case of the Rashim al-Nashiri, who's accused of being responsible for the bombing of the USS Cole. The torture techniques that they were subjected to by the CIA, which at the time the CIA's torture program was authorized, the government had said, don't worry, just get the information. These guys will never see the light of day again. And then it's like, oops, because, and this is what I write about in my book, The War in Court, so many lawyers fought against the government on his torture program, just won a couple of battles that just took, active use of torture off the table. But you can't unring the torture bell. And so there have been no prosecutions. There's been ongoing years and years of pretrial hearings in the 9/11 case and in other cases at the Guantanamo military commissions. And we are still, as a country, not coming to terms with not only what is torture and how terrible it is, but also the fact that a government that tortured people, it literally cannot prosecute them. And so you get all these politicians today hyperventilating over the prospect of plea bargain negotiations for the 9/11 case because they can't be prosecuted because of their torture. And everybody's saying taking the death penalty off the table is unacceptable. These guys must die. It's just a further example of the American public's understanding being completely manipulated by partisan and inaccurate understandings of reality, and then running with their kind of preferred talking point lines into Nonsenseville.
Yeah, films like The Manchurian Candidate, that's why it's so relevant. It can't take the politics at face value. There's always a hidden message. And what seems to be true on the surface is often not the case.
Well, I would just encourage people to watch the original Manchurian Candidate and the rack and just think about some of these issues in the context of how they bear on the contemporary period. This is one of the things I love about your podcast and what I love about films. Films really help us see well-made films about important topics or topics that really touch a nerve in public sentiment really can have an edifying effect. And so, I'm a huge fan of film. So I would say these two films definitely warrant a watching, especially The Rack, which hasn't been seen much. But if you keep watching on Turner Classic Movies, it may pop up again sometime soon.
Yeah, I think The Rack is available on Amazon for a small fee, I think, to rent. You're right, Lisa. To watch these films together is really helpful. And the way you've talked about it in the podcast, and I encourage people to read your paper as well as your book, The War in Court, for a larger background on these issues.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's been great to have you on, and take care.